Коллеги, добрый день.
Dear colleagues, hello. We are here at the Moscow Urban Forum, and we are now beginning a series of interviews that we will have 4 panelists. Those interviews will be dedicated to Age of Agglomerations developers' view. We have esteemed guests with us today. I will introduce you in Russian. So, we have here Ahmad Abdelrazaq. He is the Executive Vice President of the High-Rise Building and Structural Engineering at Samsung C&T Corporation. Ahmad has participated in the development of Burj Khalifa, the tallest high-rise in the world. We also have here Eng Cheong Teo. He is the CEO at Surbana, Jurong. It's a consulting company in urban, industrial, and infrastructural development. So, colleagues, we will be discussing today the ways and the trends of urban development and agglomerations, including complex land management, new rules and regulations of land usage. So how does it affect the developers' perception, our industry, and the neighboring industries? So my first question that is addressed to both of you: how do you assess the current situation globally in terms of the ways developers industry changes and evolves, taking into the consideration the fact that the world is changing and the approach is changing? So what is your perspective, yours and your clients? Who will be the volunteer to answer the first?
Is the on? All right. Okay, there's a very, very broad question. Maybe I just relate some of the more recent feedback that we get from the people that we work with. We work a lot with developers, developers from Singapore, obviously, developers from Southeast Asia, and even more so developers from China. And one of the recent trends that we've found is that a lot of these Chinese developers are going out in a big way into Southeast Asia because of the One Belt, One Road initiative or Belt and Road initiative. And they are not completely comfortable sometimes working on their own in Southeast Asia, so they are always looking for partners, and that's how they end up talking to us. And that in a way, because of all these various feedback, I have the sense that there are currently a lot of opportunities for developers in various parts of the world, because a lot of countries are trying to urbanize, are trying to grow economically, and they're always thinking of new areas to develop into special economic zones, new areas to develop for housing for the people, and infrastructure like ports and airports and so on. So a lot of opportunities if you are a developer, and the question is really 3 things. First is financing. Where do you get the financing at a low cost of capital so that you can generate a good return? Number 2, in the construction phase, how do you do it as effectively and efficiently as possible? And number 3, after you have constructed whatever assets, how do you manage and operate it efficiently? And I think these are the 3 things that all developers are concerned with. And increasingly, we see that financing is getting to be a very, very interesting issue. A lot of developers talk to us, hoping that we can bring in other investors to help share the risk, help share the cost of capital. And maybe later I can talk a little bit about some specific projects that we have done, and maybe over the years, and that can bring up some of the more interesting things.
Okay. I think for me, I have a different angle of it, from both a designer perspective and also a contractor. Again, this is just different, which complement the developer in every project that we essentially do. But one of the things that I see is a critical right now, I think there's a huge development technologically but many of the cities and planners, engineers, designers, contractors, owners are not able to really to capitalize what is there. We work both in developed countries and underdeveloped countries, and how you deal with the projects is a completely different situation. One of the things that I think is for developed countries where, for example, in China, I happen to work in the Jimma Tower, which was the first high-rise building project in Shanghai. At that time, I can tell you a story when I worked on that project. Essentially, the Chinese were just changing, understanding more about high-rise building development, high-rise building technologies. They didn't even have codes, which was essentially based on the Russian standards. Today, they have learned enormously over a period of 20 years, almost to a point where I would say they become some of the most advanced countries. And there's a lot of migration from suburban areas or country areas into cities. So a lot of new cities got created, and it was done very, very, very fast. The question is always should come to our mind is, when we do that, whether it is migrating or developing in new cities, or looking at underdeveloped countries and creating new cities, what plans are we doing to make these cities sustainable? And one of the things that we need to look at is, number one, creating a smart city. How you operate a city efficiently, effectively. Obviously, big cities like in Singapore or Hong Kong or New York or Moscow, they already have a very, very massive infrastructure that continue to develop. But with a newer city and newer areas, I think we need to think more creatively about creating sustainable, more smart cities. The second point of view that I'd like to make right now, if you look at the world and look at the disaster that happens due to whether it is a seismic event or due to very large wind events, some of the cities like Haiti was completely destroyed in a matter of days. What do we do? China, high seismic events, complete city get destroyed, completely not functional. We go to even Tokyo, right? Same thing. Los Angeles, same thing. So I think now what we have is technologies in which we were able to implement to make the building sustainable from a point of view, preventing damage and saving lives. So as part of a city planner, as we go around the world, I think these are points we really have to take to heart to make sure that we build cities that are sustainable, that are green, that operate efficiently.
Maybe I continue from here. You talk about building cities, and I just want to highlight a project that is from some time ago. In the 90s, I think China was opening up and trying to attract a lot of investments. So a lot of Chinese officials came to Singapore at the time, and I was working with the Singapore government. At the time, they wanted to see how Singapore do our industrial zone, how we do our investment promotion, how we do our public housing and so on. And we had a government-to-government project with China in this place called Suzhou. Suzhou is about 80 kilometers west of Shanghai. And at the time in the 90s, it was basically a small city. And we chose that the old city of Suzhou, next to it, we chose a piece of land that is about 70 square kilometers. And we said that we would do the planning, we would build the industrial township, and we will manage it. And introduce a lot of Singapore government policies and Singapore way of doing things, and see whether that turns out to be a good model for China to replicate in other parts of China if it works out well. And in the 90s, we did exactly that. We had a government agreement with China, and we went in. I was based in Suzhou myself for 2 years during the time, and we went in. It was basically paddy field, and we put in the infrastructure. We did the master planning. We did an investment promotion to bring in, and one of the first companies was Samsung. We went in there. So today, if you go to Suzhou, in the past it was basically a very small city. Today, Suzhou is ranked among the top 5, I think, in terms of GDP per capita, in terms of GDP, in terms of export, in terms of trade. And if you go to Singapore, you may sometimes be mistaken that it's a little bit of a Singapore. And I think that is really a very good project in that you build a new city next to an old city. You introduce interesting ways of doing things that is pro-business, that attract a lot of investments, and contributed to a rise of income of the people there. And just to give an anecdote, when I was based in Suzhou, I had a chauffeur, and his name is Mr. Chen. So Mr. Chen was a chauffeur in Suzhou, and years later, when I was in Singapore, I met this Mr. Chen at one of the shopping complex. And I was surprised. I said, "What are you doing in Singapore?" And he said, "Oh, I'm on training." And I was even more surprised. Why would the driver needs to be trained in Singapore? Because driving you can train in China easily, right? So I was very surprised, and he could see my surprised look. And then he took out his name card. He was a general manager of a logistic company. So that was the kind of transformation that we have seen in Suzhou, which also was replicated in many parts of China. But in Suzhou, I think it was one of the earliest cities to be transformed. And I think in Singapore's project in Suzhou played a big role, I would say, in terms of introducing...
Mr. Teo, yeah, спасибо большое.
Well, thank you.
We should go a bit forward. Я думаю, если мы сравним...
So I think if we compare in terms of career, many chauffeurs made amazing careers in Russia too. But, you know, with powerful friends, not as powerful as Mr. Teo, of course, but let's go back to the topic. Our colleagues have talked about global agglomeration development, while our topic is specifically the developer's perspective, and I would like to make my question more specific. So, how do you see the difference between the developer's perspective today from what was there 10 years ago, before the 2008 crisis? So how did it shift? How did it change? What was the perspective back then, and what is the perspective now for the developer? What's the difference?
Well, I'm not exactly a developer, but I can tell you the key point from their perspective. Again, it depends where you are, where you work, what are the people need, right? You look at a city that is very well developed and advanced, and the way you work with them and what their needs are is a completely different from when you're working in Africa, or you're working on Middle East, or you're working, is a completely different perspective. And I think if I answer, this is...
No, the question is not between different regions, but between now and between 10 years ago.
10 years ago, okay. I think right now, obviously, most of the developers, I think I'll leave it to you to speak a little bit more about. I think, you know, obviously 10 years ago, we dealt with a much smaller developer. Right now, for example, take Emaar. When we started in Burj Khalifa, it was a very, very, very small company. In fact, when I went to the sales office, there was nothing in Dubai, right? And they have only the first project they did was the Burj Khalifa and the marina, three small buildings. And out of these buildings, they had a vision to grow enormously. Now you look at them, what they do today, and what they have done to Dubai as an example is unbelievable in terms of the revenue, in terms of the profits, in terms of the number of buildings they build very fast, in terms of technologies they have brought to Dubai from a desert land to where it is today is completely different. Now, if you're looking at more advanced countries like New York or other things, I don't think there's a huge difference other than trying to build a lot of investors. 10 years ago, China didn't invest anywhere else except China. Today, they're investing everywhere. So these are the kind of things that we see now out there.
I guess it also depends on what developers we're talking about. They are the government as a developer, they're private sector developers. And the government developers, generally, I think the perspective will be, what can I do in this project to enhance the city, to improve the standard of living of the people? So if the government is the developer, we have to address those issues. How do you improve this city as a result of this development? If the developer is a private sector, then obviously he's thinking of profit. So how do you help this developer build something that is what the residents want and still can make money at the same time? So then there is a very different perspective. And also depends on where the developer comes from and whether they are financially strong. Today, if you look at the situation compared to the past, I think the Chinese companies are financially strong. At least they have access to bank loans, access to capital, and therefore they can get a lot more things done. Some of the developers in the region, in Southeast Asia and so on, may not be as financially as liquid, and therefore it's a bit more difficult for them to have access to capital. And that's compared to 2008 when after the financial crisis.
Yeah, the other thing that we see which is really important is subject.
Что касается частных застройщиков,
Thank you very much. У нас коллеги, видите, они говорят, что есть укрупнение девелоперов.
colleagues, you say that we have enlargement of developers and trend to, well, in China, more and more private developers. And let me ask a question to Mr. Abdelrazaq. Ahmad, you took part in the creation of the highest building in the world, and as is known, well, if we look at Middle Ages, well, the highest buildings were churches. The most influential people were priests. Then we look at century, 17th, 18th century Europe. The highest buildings were correspondingly castles, and the most influential people were kings, princes, counts, who managed the states and had the castles with towers. And starting from 20th century, we have had skyscrapers, and the CEO are the most influential people, heads of corporations. So looking at the last millennium of humanity, well, people in power, they want to build something high. So my question is very simple. You know this from inside out. Is it economically feasible to build skyscrapers, or is it only about ambition to realize them?
That's a really very good question. I think historically, as most of you know, about in early 1900s, practically we didn't even have the principles of tall buildings all figured out 100 years ago. We didn't have the right materials to deal with, to go really high. So the best we can do is work with the stone and masonry, and there is a limit in terms of how far you can go with those. And material over the centuries have changed a lot. And tall buildings, essentially, I would say, is more related to technologies than anything else. So whatever is the latest technologies that we have in the industry, they're ready to use it. If you take one building and look at all the things that we have to do to build it, the number of consultants that we need to engage, to build a building that is efficient, sustainable, operational, we need to continually to use what are the latest technologies that we have. There is essentially, technically, there is no limit in terms of how high you can go. That can be managed without any problem. But the question is, do we really want to get there? But from a sustainability standpoint, also we need to think about what is the benefit is really of tall buildings. Essentially, if you look at Singapore and Hong Kong, they're full of tall buildings. Same thing with in New York and very, very dense areas. Why? Because it's sustainable. They have everything that you need to do is within a very, very short area. The impact and the demand on the infrastructure is the least minimal. When we talk about Burj Khalifa, when I started to, since you asked Burj Khalifa, I really couldn't understand. When I walked to the site, there was absolutely nothing. I couldn't even know where the site was. Only said, oh, there is some water there. And we, at that time, I was actually in a design, working with a design at the Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, and I was doing the structural design. And then I couldn't believe, is this really a real project? There is nothing around it. There is no infrastructure. There is nothing to connect to. It was just a barricade of but the vision of the government itself, we want to build a new city. They have a vision to build something that's very unique, to bring a lot of attraction into the city. And during that time, even that is what material they use, you know, and so on. And so many things goes through your mind. But ultimately, what I would say is there is no limit in terms of how hard you go. The technology is there. We can solve all problems. Again, the wind and the seismic and the safety and sustainability, all these things have to be considered and taken into account. And the key point that's happening in Dubai right now is densify, consolidate and densify to reduce the demand on the infrastructure and to create a sustainable city. So obviously we can talk a lot about what makes tall buildings efficient. There are many, many things that you have to do in the pre-planning stage to make the building very efficient, very economical, utilize the least amount of material, make it LEED certified, the least amount of energy and so on.
Спасибо, Ahmad. Ну,
Yeah, Ahmad. Well, I guess sometimes when economic feasibility is justified and sometimes it's ambition. Well, and Mr. Teo, next question to you. Well, you as a consultant of infrastructure and planning of cities, well, could you tell me, now there is a trend of large projects, comprehensive development territories in Russia and abroad. Do you think it's a temporary trend, or this trend has come for a long time, the process of increasing the format of development and developers? Will it go on?
My sense is that the trend has been around for some time and it's not going to disappear anytime soon. And I think that just reflects the fact that developers see the opportunity of putting different types of property assets within a single area and each having synergy with one another and generating higher returns. And if the developers have access to capital, then that would be a good project to go on. And I think many of them are doing that within Russia, within China, within Southeast Asia. We are increasingly seeing bigger and bigger projects which aims to have commercial, residential, infrastructure, office, retail and so on. And they have a mix. And if you do the mix well, if you design the mix well, actually it will become a very good environment for work, live and play. And that can generate a lot more higher returns because people generally like to go to an area where you can live comfortably, where you have good jobs, and where you can have some recreation and entertainment. I think that is a good mixture if you design it well.
спасибо.
Thank you. Well, I guess we have a chance to ask a question to some of you, my dear listeners. Well, you can ask questions. Because we do not have such professionals, experts every day.
I've been coming back and forth to Russia. We're working on Lakta Center, which is one of the St. Petersburg project. And I also worked on back in 2005, 2006, when the Complex Federation Tower actually started, which was one of the first high-rise building projects really started to develop in Russia. One of the things that, again, as I mentioned before, when we started in China, for example, one of the challenges that we have right now is the codes and standards and approval process in Russia, as an example, which tend to affect the progress sometimes of the project if it's not done well. And this is something I think, and also the new technologies that we see worldwide, I think we find it a little bit difficult to go through. These are some of the challenges that we see in Russia. But at the same time, I would say people will continue to migrate to the cities, and I think there is an opportunity, for example, in major cities where great things can happen. And a lot of changes I've seen in the last 10 years, when I came here 2005 versus today, what's going on in Russia. And I think you have everything. I think it's just a matter of the people getting unleashed, and I think it's just in terms of what they wanted to do, and they can create really great things. And for example, the St. Petersburg project, the Lakta Center, is a good example of what benefit could they bring to the city. It's a huge benefit. So anyway, this is just a point of view. Yeah. Thank you.
Спасибо, Ахмад, но я все-таки...
Ahmad, thank you, but I'd like to ask somebody from the audience to ask several questions before we end this session. But please speak in the microphone. Yes, Sergey Andreevich Gormatov, a graduate of Moscow Architecture Institute. Well, fourth-year student, I learned that we have a string type of technology transport, which enables you to reach Beijing from London in 8 hours. What do you know about it, if you know anything, and what is your attitude to it, about this string type of transport?
Can you repeat the name of the project?
String transport.
It's called Transport Unitsky. It's tested in Belarus now. Other names I don't know.
Фамилия Юницкий.
The Unitsky string transport. String transport. And they have a pilot project in Belarus.
So,
Yeah.
but, sorry.
Not exactly sure what you're talking about. I know there are some innovations or research into hyperloop transportation where you have this thing and it just somehow goes straight at a very high speed. I don't know how it works. I don't know the physics behind it, but I certainly hope that it comes up with something interesting for all of us.
Keep dreaming, though. I mean, you'll never know. Technology will catch up.
But I think a more interesting development for transportation is autonomous vehicles, driverless vehicles. I think that it will come about in a big way for transport infrastructure and transport system. Just imagine you can have autonomous vehicles transporting cargoes. So effectively in every city, you can have people moving in the daytime, but in the nighttime when we're all sleeping, the cargoes are moving, autonomous, without drivers. I think that is a much more interesting and more realistic development in the next few years.
Спасибо, коллеги. Может быть, еще есть один вопрос?
Thank you. One more question, perhaps we have time, and then we finish our panel. Hello. Well, Moscow has a program of renovation, as you may know, and it means that a lot of residential areas with low-rise residential buildings are demolished and the new buildings are constructed for those residents. In terms of developer, what is your opinion about such projects? Yeah, just 1 minute answer.
Outside, I was going to ask the mayor about this. I thought it's very interesting. If it's done well, you will do a lot of good for the Moscow city.
It depends on the quality of the project, you know, in terms of what the status. Is it flexible enough to, you know, renovate it and make it good, or what is the quality of the building? I think this plays a very important role. So you don't want to start a project that is not recoverable, in which you try to make it better, you end up paying more than making a new one. So this is one of the things. For historic ones, obviously a different issue. And usually they tend to be, if they are good buildings, you can change them.
Спасибо большое, коллеги.
Thanks a lot, colleagues. Well, let us thank our esteemed speakers. They flew from far away and with unique experience. We'll have more opportunity to meet and discuss them. I am Nikolai Kazansky and my esteemed colleagues. Well, and with